There's a fire burning in north central Washington right now that most of the country has never heard of, and it is, by one specific measure, the most dangerous active wildfire in the entire state. Not the largest, not the deadliest, the most out of control. It has been burning for more than 2 weeks. It has already crossed the acreage threshold federal agencies use to define a megafire, and as of the most recent update available, crews have only managed to secure a defensive line around roughly 1 section in 10 of its entire perimeter. That fire is called the Sinlahekin fire, and it is currently the clearest, most unfiltered picture of exactly how terrifying the reality on the ground has become across a state that declared a statewide emergency at the start of this month and has not been able to fully get ahead of it since. Today, we're going to follow this one fire from the moment it started to where it stands right now, because its story, more than almost any other fire currently burning in Washington, shows you what out of control actually looks like when you strip away the headlines and look directly at the numbers. If tracking this fire and the rest of Washington's active emergency as it develops is something you want to keep doing, subscribing means you catch every update the moment new containment numbers or evacuation orders come in, because this situation is still very much unfolding. Let's go back to the moment it started. Lightning struck roughly 12 miles west of the small town of Sinlahekin in Okanogan County on July the 26th, 2026. For its first several days, the fire that would become known as Sinlahekin did what most lightning-caused fires in this part of the state do every summer. It burned steadily through remote terrain without drawing much attention beyond the immediate area. That changed fast. By July 31st, 5 days after ignition, it had already grown to roughly 30,000 acres, still sitting at 0%. Containment. Then, a weekend of strong wind arrived, and everything about this fire's trajectory shifted. By the morning of August the 2nd, it had more than doubled in just 2 days, reaching nearly 74,000 acres, still with 0% containment, as wind-driven embers landed miles ahead of the main fire front and ignited entirely new pockets of flame that crews had no way to anticipate in time. Level 3. Go now. Evacuation orders expanded dramatically that same day, covering all territory west of the Okanogan River north to the town of Oroville, including the community around Palmer Mountain. The fire kept climbing. By August 3rd, it had reached roughly 85,000 acres, still at 0% containment. By August 4th, it had crossed 100,000 acres, officially becoming a megafire, with containment finally beginning to register at 5%. That megafire designation is not just a dramatic label, it is a specific federal classification reserved for fires that burn past 100,000 acres, a scale reached by only a small fraction of wildfires nationwide in any given year, yet one that accounts for the overwhelming majority of total acreage burned across the country every season. Crossing that threshold marks the point where a fire is moved into the category most likely to require sustained, weeks-long commitment of major firefighting resources rather than a quick, local response. Exactly the trajectory Sinlahekin has followed since the wind picked up in late July. As of the most recent confirmed update on August 5th, the fire sat at 117,078 acres, with containment inching up to 9%. And here's the detail that should genuinely concern anyone tracking this fire closely. The growth in containment between August 4th and August 5th essentially stalled. The acreage barely moved. The containment percentage barely moved. Fire behavior analysts read that specific pattern as crews holding their current position rather than actively advancing new line, a standoff rather than a fire in genuine retreat, still fully capable of renewed explosive growth the moment conditions shift again. A standoff like this typically happens for one of two overlapping reasons. Either the terrain and fuel conditions along the remaining uncontained edge are too dangerous or too remote for crews to safely build direct line, forcing reliance on slower, indirect containment strategies, or the fire is still producing enough active heat along that edge that any line crews do manage to build risks being overrun before it can be reinforced. Fire officials have described isolated pockets of unburned fuel continuing to smolder and flare up well within sections of the perimeter that might otherwise look secure on a map. Exactly the kind of lingering activity that keeps a containment percentage frozen even after a fire's overall acreage has largely stopped expanding. To understand why this specific fire has been so brutally difficult to get ahead of, you need to understand what it is actually burning through. Sinlahekin is spreading primarily across short grass, terrain officially classified at around 1 foot in height, exactly the kind of fuel that produces the fastest, most explosive, most wind-driven fire behavior of any terrain type in the American West. Grass ignites almost instantly and can carry flame across open ground far faster than crews can physically build containment line ahead of it, which is precisely why this fire's growth chart does not look like a steady climb. It looks like a series of sudden, violent jumps every single time. Regional wind picked up even slightly. Fire behavior analysts describe this using a measurement called rate of spread, essentially how much ground a fire's leading edge can cover in a given stretch of time, under specific conditions. Grass fires can post some of the fastest rates of spread of any wildland fuel type in existence, since dried grass catches almost instantly and burns with very little resistance, unlike dense timber that has to work through bark, branches, and trapped moisture before a fire front can fully establish itself. Add wind gusts strong enough to loft burning embers well ahead of the main fire, the exact spot fires that drove Sinlahekin's explosive growth in early August. And a fire can effectively skip entire sections of terrain, igniting new fronts miles beyond any line crews have managed to establish. That is the precise mechanism behind the jump from 30,000 acres to nearly 74,000 acres in a single weekend. Wind-driven spotting outrunning the physical construction of new containment line faster than any ground crew could realistically match. Now here is what makes Sinlahekin's story genuinely terrifying rather than simply large. It is not happening in isolation, and it is not even the worst managed fire relative to its size in the state. Compare it directly to the Kaiser Canyon fire, burning less than a county away on the Colville Reservation. Kaiser Canyon ignited 10 days earlier, on July 16th, also from lightning, also through grass and light timber. It also endured an explosive early growth phase, at one point more than doubling in a single day, eventually reaching over 136,000 acres, making it the physically larger of the two fires. But Kaiser Canyon now sits at roughly 48% contained, essentially half of its perimeter secured, with a proper defensive line established across most of its footprint. Sinlahekin, despite being the smaller fire, remains at less than 1/5 of that containment level. Two fires, similar fuel, similar drought conditions, similar terrain in the same general region of the same state, and one of them is nearly half under control, while the other is still almost entirely open. The gap is not simply a matter of one incident being managed worse than the other, and it is worth being fair to the crews working Sinlahekin specifically, since the underlying terrain each fire encountered was not perfectly identical either. Kaiser Canyon's terrain around Owie Flats and the surrounding grazing land offered crews somewhat more accessible ground for building direct containment line early on, while portions of Sinlahekin's perimeter run through steeper, more rugged terrain near Tillman Mountain and Quartz Hill, ground that is inherently harder and slower to work regardless of how many personnel are assigned. Comparing the two fires side by side is less about assigning blame and more about illustrating exactly how much terrain, timing, and fuel conditions can push two fires burning under nearly identical regional weather into dramatically different positions within less than 2 weeks of each other. That gap is the real human-scale terror hiding underneath the acreage numbers. It means that for the families living inside Sinlahekin's evacuation zones, roughly 91% of the fire threatening their homes has no secured defensive line whatsoever. It means the fire can, at any point, without much additional warning, do exactly what it already did between July 31st and August 2nd, more than double in size within 48 hours. Level 3 evacuation orders have covered the Totes Coulee, Gold Hill, and Loomis areas, the Pine Creek corridor, and the broad swath of territory stretching west of the Okanogan River all the way north to Oroville. A shelter is operated out of the Community Cultural Center in Tonasket, housing residents who, in many cases, had only minutes of real notice before evacuation orders reached their phones. Sit with that specific detail for a moment, because it is the part of this story that acreage statistics tend to erase entirely. A Level 3 evacuation order is not a suggestion delivered with time to plan. It is the highest tier that exists, meaning leave immediately. And the families who received that order along the Totes, Coulee, and Pine Creek corridors this month had to make split-second decisions about what to grab, which pets could fit in a vehicle, and whether there was even time to gather medications before pulling out of the driveway. Multiple roads have remained closed for more than a week, including sections of Sinlahekin Road and several Forest Service routes feeding into the active fire zone, cutting off normal travel for communities across a wide stretch of the county, which means even residents who evacuated safely have faced an additional week or more of disrupted access to jobs, medical appointments, and basic groceries in towns like Tonasket and Oroville. More than 1,500 personnel are now assigned to the incident under a Type 1 incident management team, the highest complexity classification used for the country's most demanding wildfire operations, and suppression costs have already climbed past $12 million. The economic toll reaches well beyond the direct cost of fighting the fire itself. Okanogan County's economy depends heavily on orchards, grazing land, and rangeland, much of which sits directly inside or immediately adjacent to Sinlahekin's expanding footprint. Ranchers have had to relocate livestock with almost no notice as evacuation zones shifted day by day. Growers with orchards near the fire's edge face a second, quieter threat beyond the flames themselves, prolonged smoke exposure that can damage the visible quality and market value of fruit still on the branch, arriving at almost exactly the point in the season when much of that fruit is approaching harvest. For a rural county where agriculture forms a meaningful share of the local economy, a fire burning this far into August, still largely uncontained, represents a financial threat that will likely outlast the fire itself by months or years. Consider what that timeline actually means for a family running an orchard operation near the fire's perimeter. Tree fruit crops cannot simply be harvested early to avoid smoke exposure. They ripen on their own schedule, meaning growers watching Sinlahekin's smoke drift across their property this month have no real option but to wait and hope the exposure does not measurably degrade the crop before it can be picked. Ranchers face a parallel problem with grazing land since native rangeland burned this late in the season does not simply regrow the following spring. The way a suburban lawn might, meaning affected grazing allotments, could remain unusable for actual livestock operations. For a year or more after the flames themselves are finally out, a slow-motion economic consequence that will still be playing out long after this video's containment numbers are out of date. Sinlahekin's story is only one piece of the larger emergency Governor Bob Ferguson declared for the entire state at the start of August. But it is arguably the piece that most directly illustrates why officials chose the word emergency rather than something softer. At the moment that statewide declaration went out, Washington was managing at least 12 major wildfires simultaneously, including the Spokane complex, which tore directly through residential neighborhoods inside the city itself, forcing 65,000 evacuations and destroying more than 600 structures before crews brought it under control. That fire, formed from the old trails, Fairview, and Autumn Lane fires burning together, only covered roughly 8,000 acres, a small fraction of Sinlahekin's footprint. Yet it produced a far larger evacuation and a far higher structure loss simply because of where it happened to burn, directly through dense city neighborhoods rather than sparsely populated rangeland. That contrast matters enormously for understanding what terrifying actually means across this statewide emergency as a whole, since it is never a single uniform threat. Spokane's danger came from proximity and density. Sinlahekin's danger comes from sheer, sustained lack of control. Both are genuinely frightening realities unfolding under the exact same emergency declaration, just through entirely different mechanisms. It included the Maudrite fire in Ferry County, now at roughly 54,000 acres and 35% contained, a considerably better ratio of progress to size than Sinlahekin has managed. It included the Little Giant Fire, which, like Sinlahekin, remains at 0% containment as of the most recent reporting, despite having burned past 70,000 acres. Comparing these fires, side by side, makes something uncomfortable clear. Raw acreage tells you almost nothing about how dangerous a fire actually still is. Some of the state's smaller fires are proportionally far more contained than some of its largest ones, and Sinlahekin currently sits near the very bottom of that list. Part of the reason Sinlahekin has struggled so much relative to its neighbors comes down to simple sequencing. Kaiser Canyon had a 10-day head start, meaning crews and aircraft had additional time to establish real containment lines before Sinlahekin even ignited, and a portion of the personnel that might otherwise have responded faster to Sinlahekin were already committed elsewhere when this fire broke out. Every additional fire igniting during a season this severe has to compete for the exact same limited pool of hand crews, aircraft, and specialized incident management teams against fires that, in many cases, already had a head start building their own defensive lines. That is not a criticism of the crews working Sinlahekin, who have continued to hold their current position under genuinely difficult conditions. It is a structural reality of what happens when a state is fighting more than a dozen major incidents at once under a single, overstretched emergency declaration. That structural strain is really the heart of what statewide emergency actually means once you get past the phrase itself. It is not simply a legal declaration unlocking emergency powers. It is an acknowledgement that no single county, no single incident management team, and no single fire department has the capacity to handle what is happening within its own borders alone. Washington's declaration activated additional National Guard resources, opened the door to the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, allowing other states to send crews and equipment, and triggered a federal emergency declaration covering 6 counties and 3 tribal nations, including the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, where Kaiser Canyon continues to burn, and by extension, the broader Okanogan County region, where Sinlahekin has done the most damage to date. Here is why "not over" is not a dramatic exaggeration for this specific fire. It is the most literal possible description of its current status. A fire sitting at 9% containment after 11 days of active. Burning has, by definition, more than 90% of its perimeter still exposed and still capable of renewed spread. The moment temperatures rise, humidity drops, or wind shifts again, precisely the combination of conditions that drove nearly every major growth spurt this fire has already experienced. Forecasters have continued to flag warmer, drier stretches ahead for the broader region, the same conditions that fueled the explosive growth phase in late July and early August, and short grass fuel, the terrain that has defined this entire fire from the very beginning, does not become meaningfully safer simply because a fire has already been burning for nearly 2 weeks. If anything, the ground immediately ahead of the fire's active edge has had additional time to dry out further while crews have been fully occupied holding the line elsewhere. If you live anywhere near an active wildfire showing this kind of stalled containment pattern, here is what genuinely matters. Do not treat how long a fire has been burning as a stand-in for how contained it actually is, since Sinlahekin has already proven a fire can burn for well over a week, while remaining almost entirely uncontained. Check the specific containment percentage directly. Pay attention to which direction the uncontained edge faces relative to where you live, rather than assuming a fire that has been in the news for several days must already be under control. Keep a go bag packed and know your evacuation level system in advance. Since this fire's history shows entire zones can shift from routine alert to immediate evacuation with very little warning once wind conditions change. And continue checking official sources like the Washington Department of Natural Resources Wildfire Portal and INCIWeb directly, rather than assuming a status update from a few days ago still reflects the current reality, since containment on a fire like this one can remain essentially frozen for days and then move dramatically within hours. There is also a broader lesson here specifically for anyone living in short grass or rangeland fire country, distinct from advice typically given for slower moving forest fire regions. Because grass fuels can carry fire so quickly once wind picks up. Waiting to see an official level 2 notice before beginning any preparation carries more risk in this kind of terrain than it might in a timber fire region. If you live in grass or rangeland country and see smoke on the horizon combined with strong wind, consider beginning preparations immediately rather than waiting for a formal warning, since Sinlahekin's own growth record shows this specific fuel type can turn a distant plume into a direct threat to a specific community within hours rather than days. The Sinlahekin fire is, right now, the clearest evidence that Washington's statewide emergency is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a description of a genuine ongoing crisis that has not been resolved. That distinction between a formal declaration and the lived reality underneath it is really what separates this fire's story from a routine wildfire update. Plenty of fires burn every summer without ever requiring a governor to invoke emergency powers, activate the National Guard, or request a federal disaster declaration covering multiple counties and tribal nations at once. Sinlahekin's continued, stubborn resistance to containment, nearly 2 weeks in, is a big part of why none of those emergency measures have been able to stand down yet, and it is a direct, honest answer to anyone wondering whether statewide emergency is still an accurate description of what Washington is currently living through. Kaiser Canyon shows what the other side of that story can look like. A fire that started under similarly severe conditions, but has been steadily, measurably brought toward control. Sinlahekin has not reached that turning point, and as of the most recent data available, nobody can tell you with confidence exactly when it will, which is precisely what makes this particular fire the most honest possible answer to the question of whether Washington's emergency is actually over. We will keep tracking Sinlahekin and the rest of Washington's active emergency as new containment numbers and evacuation updates come in. If you want those updates the moment they land, subscribing is the way to make sure you do not miss them, and if you live in Okanagan County or anywhere else currently watching a fire near your own home, behave. This, unpredictably, tell us in the comments. What conditions actually look like on a map rarely captures what it actually feels like to live inside it, waiting to find out which direction the wind decides to blow next. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one. And if this fire is still burning by the time you're watching, know that the numbers in this video were accurate the day they were recorded, and check official sources directly for whatever has changed since.